Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look as we near the end of Paul Copan's Is God a Mortal Monster? Here's the cover of that book. Paul Copan in this work takes a look at several of the concepts and stories in the Old Testament and shows how they can, in fact, contrary to the view of the skeptic and the new atheist, how these stories can be reconciled to the concept of a loving and good God that the Christians believe in. These are the contents of Paul Copan's Is God a Mortal Monster? We're getting close to the end. Here is Paul Copan. He is a professor in Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. He's written a bunch on apologetics and philosophy. In chapter 19, we look at, can you have a more objective morality without a law-giving God? And we see how the theistic worldview is the divine foundation of goodness. Paul Copan begins his chapter by saying Christopher Hitchens throws down the gauntlet. Christopher Hitchens says, I defy you or anyone to name one more deed that I would not do unless I became a Christian. Christopher Hitchens is saying that it's possible for non-Christians to do good. And that's true. Non-Christians can do good deeds. Sam Harris writes of the myth of secular moral chaos. That is, morality and social order don't need God as their basis. That's what Sam Harris says. After all, there are plenty of good moral atheists and many immoral religious devotees. There are plenty of people who will name the name of God who live immoral lives. Likewise, there are plenty of people who deny God's existence and yet live moral lives. People like Harris reject the notion that rape or killing children is wrong just because God says it's wrong. Likewise, another new atheist philosopher, Daniel Dennett, challenges the notion that goodness is opposed to scientific materialism. Daniel Dennett says, quote, there's not reason at all why disbelief in the immateriality or immortality of the soul should make a person less caring, less moral, less committed to the well-being of everybody on earth than somebody who believes in the spirit. So, just because you don't believe in a God does not mean, just because you don't believe in a God, does not mean that you can't be a just person, a loving person, a person who has joy, a person who appreciates beauty, a person who has religious freedom. Indeed, those calling themselves spiritual can be cruel, arrogant, self-centered, and utterly concerned about moral problems of this world. Unfortunately, that's true. And there are plenty of Christians who, professing Christians, that give God a bad name by their view of, by some of these character traits that Dennett identifies. In his BBC anti-religious documentary, The Root of All Evil, Richard Dawkins insists that kindness, that generosity, and that goodness can be found in human nature, and that Darwinism explains how kindness, generosity, and goodness can be found in human nature. Well, how does this happen? Dawkins says we have altruistic genes. He says that evolution gave us altruistic genes. Dawkins says that we are genetically wired to scratch another's back. Dawkins says, in other words, our genes make us moral. Genes create morality. So we don't need God to be moral. We have the genes to make us moral already. We don't need God. We humans have a moral conscience and a moral empathy that are constantly evolving. So we're becoming more, apparently according to Dawkins, we're becoming more moral. So the message from all these atheists that we've identified, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, is loud and clear. The people can be moral without believing in God. A more careful examination reveals that the new atheists are right on one level, but the new atheists are wrong on another level. So let's look at, is this a matter of consistency? Though accusing Yahweh of being a moral monster, Richard Dawkins has his own problem. Richard Dawkins has gone on record denying the very existence of evil and goodness. Dawkins says, quote, "If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies are exactly what we should expect, along with equally good fortune. Such a universe would neither be evil nor good in intention. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." End quote by Dawkins. The blind, pitiless indifference quote is well known in circles on the internet. In his book, A Devil's Chaplain, Richard Dawkins asserts, quote, "Science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. That is a matter for individuals and for society," end quote. If science alone gives us knowledge, as Dawkins claims, then how can he consider God's actions immoral or religion the root of all evil? As we'll see, Richard Dawkins is helping himself to the metaphysical resources of a worldview that he repudiates. He's making a moral statement, and he's, as Frank Turek would say, he's stealing from God and able to do that. So now let's look at the difference between knowing versus being. Let's be clear. New atheists are absolutely correct that we don't need to believe in God or follow the Bible to have a general knowledge of what's right and wrong. Like theists, atheists have been made in God's image, and they can recognize the same sorts of virtues and behaviors as atheists themselves like to point out. The atheist will be quick to say that the same thing that Copan just said here, that they don't need to believe in God to live moral lives and be kind to people and do good deeds and be servants and all the types of moral behaviors that the Bible commends. The atheists will say they don't need a God to be generally good people. And Copan agrees with that. He says that the new atheists he agrees with the new atheists that they don't need to believe in God or follow the Bible to do basic good things. Having been made in God's image and the divine image, we've been designed to function properly by living morally. So if we take our conscience seriously, as we see the Gentiles should have done in the first 2 chapters of the prophet Amos, we can get a lot right morally. Those denying that kindness is a virtue or that torturing babies for fun is wrong don't need an argument. They need psychological and spiritual help. They're suffering from moral malfunction. When people tell Copan, well, the 9/11 terrorists sincerely believed they were doing what was right, Copan replies, a lot of people in psychiatric wards believe that they're Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, or Napoleon Bonaparte. Just because you believe something is right doesn't mean it is right. Those 9/11 terrorists were sincere that what they were doing was right. And a lot of people in psychiatric wards are sincere in their belief that they are somebody that they're not. So you can't just say that being sincere is all you need to be right. Sincerity isn't necessarily an indication of proper function, Copan says. Some atheists will say that we know rape is wrong because it violates the victim's rights and rips apart the social fabric. The problem with moral atheism, though, is that it doesn't go far enough. Notice how atheists who believe in real right and real wrong make a massive intellectual leap of faith. They believe that somehow moral facts were eternally part of the furniture of reality, but that from impersonal and valueless slime, human persons possessing rights, dignity, worth, and duties were eventually produced. So how can slime that does not possess rights, slime that does not possess dignity, slime that does not possess worth, slime that does not have duties. How can that produce someone, turn into someone that suddenly has rights, that suddenly has dignity, that suddenly has worth, and that suddenly has important duties? These moral truths were anticipating the evolution of morally valuable human beings who would have duties to obey them. Maybe that's what they would say. Yes, atheists can know that rape is wrong. But that's no surprise if they've been made in God's image, whom they refuse to acknowledge. Because God's written his law on our hearts, whether we believe in him or not. He's written his law on our hearts, and so we know basic right from wrong. The more fundamental question that atheism seems unable to answer is, how did they come to be rights-bearing, valuable persons? The problem isn't one of knowing, it's one of being. Let's change the scenario from rape on the street to the use of a date rape drug at a party. Wanting to get what he wants, a young man places this date rape drug, into the drink of an unsuspecting woman. Suppose this man's nice enough to take certain precautions so there are no obvious consequences to his action. I think Copan is speaking about pregnancy or sexually transmitted disease. The woman wakes up later, not knowing the difference. Why is this man who raped this woman, why is this act still so repugnant? I think of the acts perpetuated by a certain famous person in the news recently that recently got released from jail for doing something like Copan just described on a repeated basis to repeated victims. Most of my listeners would probably know it, to whom it is I refer. Why is this act still so repugnant? After all, the woman doesn't know anything, the guy had his pleasure, and no one's the wiser. And why should Dawkins be outraged at such an action? After all, as Dawkins says, human beings simply dance to the music of their DNA. There's a deviation from genetically produced kindness and generosity. It's truly not immoral, it's just a genetic glitch. It's wrong to rape a girl, whether she knows what's happening or not, because the girl has intrinsic dignity and rights. The girl is created in the image of God, just like the rapist. For the same reason, it's wrong to mock and insult the mentally challenged, even if they don't seem to be hurt by these verbal assaults, even if they don't know they're being insulted. Because the mentally challenged person is likewise created in the image of God. Where then do dignity and rights come from in a world of electrons and selfish genes? How can there be dignity and rights if we're just molecules in motion? The doctrine of the image of God supports our strongest intuitions that humans are not objects to use and abuse, but persons who should be respected and treated fairly before the law. Because we're created in the image of God, it is true that there is objective morality. Because people are created in the image of God, it is wrong to take the life of another who's created in the image of God. That's why murder is wrong. Because we're created in the image of God, it's wrong to force oneself sexually upon someone. That's why rape is wrong. That's why adultery is wrong. Because whether you believe in God or not, you've made vows to each other before people. And to break those vows is inherently wrong. So, intrinsically valuable thinking persons don't come from impersonal, non-conscious, unguided, valueless processes over time. To believe that one came from impersonal, non-conscious, unguided, valueless processes over time is to say that that person who came from those processes has no significance, has no value, has no importance. And if we believe that people have no value, have no purpose, have no importance, then we could treat them however we wanted, however we felt like. And doing so wouldn't be wrong to do. But we would all agree that it would be wrong to bully somebody just for the sake of our own pleasure. It would be wrong to rape someone just for the sake of our own pleasure. We would agree, whether you're a theist or not, that it's wrong to do those things. And Copan is saying that it's wrong to do those things because every human has the divine image. And because we have the divine image, that's why it's wrong to do those things. A personal, self-aware, purposeful, good God provides the much-needed context that a godless universe just can't provide. Personhood and morality are necessarily connected. Moral values are rooted in personhood. Without a personal God, no persons and thus no moral values would exist at all. Only if God exists can moral properties be realized. Some atheists will claim that moral values are just there. I've heard something like that before, I think. That having certain moral values just amounts to common sense. That these are just necessary truths that are part of the furniture of the universe. That certain moral values are just necessary truths that are part of the furniture of the universe. If that's the case, that moral values are just there, that moral values are just a necessary part of the universe, if that's true, as Copan just noted, then what a whopping coincidence that these moral laws were somehow anticipating the eventual emergence of moral creatures who would then have the duty to obey these laws. These laws were just there, and they've always been there, and the people who evolved into a world that already had these laws. I guess that's the erroneous claim that Copan is trying to explain. God's existence and creation of humans makes better sense of the connection between genuine, universal, moral standards, which are rooted in God's nature, and human dignity and worth. Even secular ethical systems, whether variations on the ethical laws of philosophers Aristotle or Kant, or perhaps some social contract view, may affirm many truths that believers in God affirm. Yes, many non-theistic, non-Christian people can be ethical, and I, for one, am very grateful for that truth. And many of their ethical principles are similar or consistent with or even the same as what many Christians would affirm. And that is what allows the society in which we live to have the harmony that it does have at times. These systems may agree that we ought to carry out certain moral obligations or cultivate certain character qualities. Even so, these systems are still incomplete because they don't offer a basis for human dignity and worth. And that's where the Christian worldview is superior, because the Christian worldview says that because we're created in God's image, we have that inherent dignity and worth that provides the basis for how we should treat others. So now let's look at the challenge that comes from Christopher Hitchens. Can we name one moral virtue in a Christian that an atheist like Christopher Hitchens does not have? Paul Copan says yes. He names multiple. First, Copan says, how about not honoring God or giving him thanks? Copan says it's morally good to honor God and give thanks to God. But a non-theist wouldn't be able to do that because they don't believe God's there to give thanks or to honor. What about the sin of human self-sufficiency and the refusal to submit to God's authority? Well, someone who does not trust in a higher power is forced to trust in themselves, ultimately, and they would submit to no one other than the government, which, by the way, is a scriptural principle, to submit to the government, to obey the government, Romans 13. The one who is self-sufficient is not going to submit to God's authority, because they're only going to submit to the government as far as doing so will keep them out of jail. But because they don't believe in God, they don't believe the need to submit to God. So they find themselves to be self-sufficient and will refuse to submit to God's authority. What about Hitchens despising God's offer of salvation or his refusal to depend on God's grace? This is another moral virtue that a Christian exercises that an atheist like Hitchens would not exercise. He doesn't believe that God is there, so he scoffs at God's offer of salvation and refuses to depend on God's grace. If the two great commands that Jesus said are to love God fully and to love one's neighbor as oneself, and Hitchens is as good as he says he is, then he still flunks the test at 50%. He might love his neighbor as himself, but he doesn't love God fully because he doesn't believe God exists. Christopher Hitchens has rejected the great and foremost command, according to Jesus in Matthew 22. I wonder, Paul Copan writes, I wonder if Hitchens worries about things. Apparently, when Paul Copan wrote this book, Is God a Moral Monster?, Christopher Hitchens was still alive. I wonder if Hitchens worries about these things. Hitchens isn't worried about casting his cares. He isn't interested in casting his cares on the one who cares for him. Does Hitchens love his enemies and do good to his enemies? Does Hitchens take God's name in vain? Does Hitchens forgive others as he's been offered forgiveness? Or let's look at one who's living now. I wonder if Richard Dawkins worries about things. Richard Dawkins probably isn't interested in casting his cares on the one who cares for him. Does Richard Dawkins love his enemies and do good to them? Does Richard Dawkins take God's name in vain? Does Richard Dawkins forgive others as he's been offered forgiveness? Perhaps we can take things a step further. Gunther Louis, the agnostic political scientist who taught at the University of Massachusetts, has observed that there are some moral values that atheism is unlikely to produce. Good. Gunther Louis, the agnostic political scientist who taught at the University of Massachusetts, he's going to tell you things that atheism can't produce. So here he comes. First, the adherents of a naturalistic ethic are not likely to produce a Dorothy Day or a Mother Teresa. Many of these people love humanity, but not individual beings with all their fallings and shortcomings. They'll be found participating in demonstrations for causes such as nuclear disarmament, but not sitting at the bedside of a dying person. An ethic of moral autonomy and individual rights, so important to secular liberals, is incapable of sustaining and nourishing values such as altruism and self-sacrifice. End quote by Louis. Along these lines, Christian writer Malcolm Muggeridge wrote that he spent many years in India and Africa, where he witnessed much righteous endeavor undertaken by Christians of all denominations. By contrast, however, Malcolm Muggeridge says, I never, as it happens, came across a hospital or orphanage run by the Fabian Society or a humanist leper colony. Even if we consider such undertakings of self-sacrifice morally praiseworthy and even heroic, they don't seem to be very biologically advantageous. Can naturalistic evolution explain morality? Dawkins claims that kindness and generosity are rooted in our genes, that we've developed an awareness of morality that proves to be biologically beneficial. Although Paul Copan, the author of this book, Is God a Moral Monster, goes into more detail on this question elsewhere, Copan will offer a few responses to Dawkins' claim here. Why should we trust our genes? If we're nothing more than the product of naturalistic evolution trying to fight, feed, flee, and reproduce, he substituted the word reproduce there, and I'm glad he did. Why trust the convictions of our minds, whether about truth or morality? If we are just molecules in motion, as Frank Turek would say, if all we care about is ourselves, basically, defending ourselves by fighting, feeding ourselves by for our sustenance, fleeing from danger and reproducing to perpetuate our species, why does morality even matter, basically? If we're just dancing to our DNA, over which we have absolutely no control, how do we know we're right about anything? If we're just molecules in motion, like Frank Turek says, if we're nothing more than our biological processes, why is there right and wrong? How do we know we're right about anything? If we're right about anything, we'd only be accidentally right, but this can't be called knowledge. As Charles Darwin mused, quote, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed by the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?" End quote. We could accidentally believe true things that help us to survive, but we could just as well have many false beliefs that help us to survive. For example, we might be hardwired to believe that humans are valuable and have rights, or that have moral duties that we have moral duties to perform. Such beliefs might help us to survive as a species, but they would be completely false. The naturalistic evolutionary process is interested in fitness or survival, not in true belief. The naturalistic evolutionary process is not interested in true belief. It's interested in fitness or survival. So not only is objective morality undermined, but so is rational thought. According to atheistic evolutionists Michael Ruse on the left and E.O. Wilson on the right, morality is a corporate illusion that has been fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Almost sounds like morality is not really a true thing, that it doesn't really matter, which is despite the claims that many atheists will make. That's really how they live, because they want to live how they want to live and not have anybody like a theist tell them they're wrong. But yet, that same atheist will say that God is wrong, that what God did in some of these Old Testament passages is wrong. In the one sense, their unkindness is wrong, but the perceived unkindness that they find in God is wrong, while the things that they do are not wrong. We think that we really ought to love little children, but we're wrong to conclude that right and wrong really exist. This illusion that we have moral duties is compelling and strong. Without it, we'd ignore or disobey our moral impulses. However, having moral inclinations is far different from having moral duties, which brings us to our next point as we move from is to ought. According to skeptic Michael Shermer, whom Dawkins approvingly cites, asking, "Why should we be moral?" is like wondering, why should we be hungry or horny? Shermer insists that the answer is that it is as much a part of human nature to be moral as it is to be hungry, horny, jealous, and in love. What Shermer says. Such drives are hardwired into us by evolution, says Michael Shermer. But as C.S. Lewis noted, moral impulses, given such hardwiring conditions, are no more true or false than a vomit or a yawn, C.S. Lewis says. Thinking I ought is on the same level as I itch. Indeed, my impulse to serve posterity is just the same sort of thing as my fondness for cheese or preferring mild or bitter beer. In fact, all Shermer can do is describe how human beings actually function, but he can't prescribe how humans ought to behave. There's no difference between whether I ought to be moral and whether I ought to be hungry, since both are functions of evolutionary hardwiring, according to Shermer. These states just are. If, on the other hand, humans are made in God's image and have value from the start, then we don't have to wonder about how to move from the is of nature to the ought of genuine moral obligation. a supremely valuable being, is at the heart of reality. No is-ought problem exists if theism is true. Let's talk about arbitrary morality. Ruse and Wilson report that instead of evolving from savanna-dwelling primates, we, like termites, could have evolved needing to dwell in darkness, eat each other's waste, and cannibalize the dead, end quote. If the latter were the case, we would extol such acts as beautiful and moral, and find it morally disgusting to live in the open air, dispose of body waste, and bury the dead. So our awareness of morality, a sense of right and wrong, and feeling of obligation to be thus governed, is of biological worth, serves as an aid to survival, and has no being beyond this. Naturalistic morality is arbitrary and could have developed in opposite directions. We happen to admire, yes, naturalistic morality, non-theistic morality is arbitrary. It picks and chooses, and could have developed in opposite directions. Yes. Since evolution is changing, morality would change. We happen to admire the morality that evolution has passed on to us, but we could be singing the praises of the very opposite morality for the same reasons. We could dance to our DNA. To illustrate further, consider the book A Natural History of Rape, co-authored by a biologist and anthropologist. The upshot of the book is that rape can be explained biologically. When a male cannot find a mate, his subconscious drive to reproduce his own species makes him force himself upon a female. After all, such acts happen in the animal kingdom with, say, male mallards or scorpion flies. The authors don't advocate rape. In fact, they claim rapists are an excuse for their misbehavior. But if the rape impulse happens to be embedded into human nature from antiquity, and if it bestows biological advantage, how can the author suggest this behavior ought to be ended? The author's resistance to rape, despite its naturalist, suggests subjective moral values that transcend nature. With a thesis like these authors in A Natural History of Rape come up with, in my experience, the stories that I've read about rape don't involve a drive to reproduce. Rape is driven by a drive for sexual fulfillment. So the co-authors of this Natural History of Rape have the wrong idea of the purpose of rape. Those who are raping are not raping because they want to have children. They're raping because because they want to reproduce their own species. They're raping because they have ungratified sexual desire that they want someone else to fulfill for them. And they can't find a mate to share life with, so they will force themselves upon someone else. The authors of A Natural History of Rape have a gross mischaracterization and misunderstanding of that part of the rape equation. It's very strange. The author's resistance to rape, despite its naturalness, suggests objective moral values that transcend nature. The authors are, Copan says, don't advocate rape, so they are resistant to rape, even though they think it's a natural part of human existence. They're resistant to it because they have objective moral values that transcend nature. An ethic rooted in nature appears to leave us with an arbitrary morality. Theism, on the other hand, begins with the human value. The is-ought gulf is easily bridged because the theist knows that as created in God's image, the fellow humans that they share this earth with are also created in God's image, and therefore they have a basic responsibility to treat others with dignity and worth and value. Again, it's hard to see how the naturalist atheist can move from material, valueless, non-conscious processes to the production of valuable, rights-bearing human beings. From valuelessness comes. Yes, if people are taught to believe that they are people who have just evolved and are not created with value from God's image, if they're taught that, then they're not going to have very good values in their lives. And you see that in many of the things that these atheists will say. Again, though, that's not to say that an atheist can't be moral. They can. And I can think of one in particular who is. Matter doesn't have the capacity to produce value. Physics textbooks don't include goodness or even consciousness in the attempted definitions of matter. By contrast, the God hypothesis doesn't force us to make a huge leap from valuelessness to value. Rather, we begin with value, which is found in God's good character, and we end with value, the divine image-bearing humans with moral responsibility and rights. A good God effectively bridges the chasm between is and ought. Value exists from the very being. It's rooted in a self-existent good God. So for all their criticisms of religion, the new atheists still lack the moral foundations to justify genuine moral criticism of theism, nor can atheism truly ground moral value or human dignity and worth. New atheists can't justify their criticism for theism. They can't ground moral value or human dignity and worth because they can't appeal to a standard outside themselves. So that is the conclusion of chapter 19 in Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Next, we will get closer to the conclusion of Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Next time will be chapter 20, Have We Moved Beyond This God? Or we have moved beyond this God, haven't we? And that discusses Jesus as the fulfiller of the Old Testament. So thank you for tuning in this time. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist, the volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.